The announcement went live on a Tuesday morning. I was at my kitchen table when I saw it. Read it once, then set my phone face down and made a coffee. By the time I came back to the table, there were 3 missed calls. My real estate agent, my brother, a friend who had told me 4 months earlier that I was making a mistake. None of them had called each other at the same time by coincidence. They had all seen the same announcement, and they had all immediately thought of the same piece of land, the one nobody had wanted for years, the one my agent had described as a dead investment not worth pursuing, the one I had bought quietly on a gray Thursday morning while everyone who knew about it thought I was making an error. I looked at the missed calls. Then I looked at the announcement again. Then I let the next call go to voicemail, because there was nothing urgent to discuss. The research had been done months ago. The purchase had been completed months ago. The waiting was over. And the conversation everyone suddenly wanted to have was one I was in absolutely no hurry to start. But to understand why that Tuesday morning felt the way it did, you need to know what the 3 weeks before the purchase actually looked like. I came across the land by accident, not through any systematic search, not through a broker bringing me something they thought I would be interested in, through a conversation at a family dinner where someone mentioned it in passing as an example of something that had been sitting unsold for so long it had become a kind of local joke. The punchline was that it had been listed, delisted, relisted, and ignored so many times that the listing agent had reportedly stopped bothering to show it. Everyone at the table laughed. I didn't laugh. I asked a few questions. Where exactly? How long had it been listed? What the asking price was? My uncle answered them with a mild confusion of someone who had mentioned something in passing and was surprised to find it taken seriously. He said it had been on the market in various forms for almost 4 years, that the asking price had dropped several times, that the current price was low enough to suggest the seller had largely given up on finding a serious buyer. He said it like that settled the matter, like a price that had dropped repeatedly over 4 years was evidence of a thing being worthless rather than evidence of a thing being mispriced by people who had given up thinking carefully about it. I noted the distinction, said nothing further at the table, and wrote down the details when I got home. The land itself was not impressive on the surface. An irregular parcel on the edge of an area that hadn't seen significant development in years. No immediate neighbors of note. No obvious infrastructure nearby. The kind of location that looks at first glance like it exists outside the natural flow of where things are happening, which is exactly why it had been sitting unsold. People drive past these places and see nothing there, and see nothing coming, and move on. I called a real estate agent I had worked with before, someone with genuine knowledge of the local market, someone whose opinion I respected enough to seek out before forming my own. He was direct in a way I had always appreciated him being. Said he knew the parcel. Said most of the serious investors in the area had looked at it at some point in past. Said the location didn't make sense for residential development at the current density limits. Said commercial development was constrained by the same factors. Said the infrastructure surrounding it was not sufficient to make it attractive for anything requiring significant access or utilities. He said it with the fluency of someone reciting an assessment that had been formed and repeated enough times to feel definitive. I asked if he had looked at it recently. He said the fundamentals hadn't changed, that there was no reason to look at it differently than it had always been looked at. I thanked him, said I would think about it. My brother's reaction was similar when I mentioned it to him, less professional in its framing, more direct in its conclusion. He said it sounded like exactly the kind of thing that traps people who think they see something others have missed. That if 4 years of serious buyers had passed on it, there was a reason. That the reason was almost certainly that the land was exactly what it appeared to be. Worthless in any practical investment sense. He said he thought I was smarter than that. The last part was meant kindly, as a warning from someone who didn't want to watch me make a mistake. I received it that way, and continued thinking about the land anyway. Because here is the thing about conventional wisdom. It is not wrong because it is conventional. It is right most of the time. Most things that look worthless are worthless. Most opportunities that everyone else has passed on have been passed on for good reasons. But conventional wisdom has a specific limitation. It is based on what people already know, on what has already been assessed using the information currently visible. It does not account for information that is not yet visible to the people doing the assessing. And the question I kept returning to was not whether the land was worth what it appeared to be worth based on what was currently known. The question was whether what was currently known was the complete picture. That is a different question entirely. And it is the question that most people never think to ask. I decided to ask it properly, not through my agent, not through anyone else's assessment, through my own research, starting from the beginning, starting with the documents that everyone technically has access to, but that almost nobody actually reads. I want to describe the research process honestly, because it is tempting to make it sound more dramatic than it was, more instinctive, more like a moment of inspired insight than what it actually was, which was 3 weeks of methodical reading through dense bureaucratic documents that most people would find immediately discouraging. That is the whole of it. No special access, no inside information, no source that wasn't available to anyone who bothered to look. Just the work of looking carefully at things that are technically public, but practically invisible because the effort required to find them and read them exceeds what most people are willing to invest. I started with the local government planning portal. Every municipality maintains one, a repository of planning applications, zoning decisions, infrastructure proposals, and development discussions going back years. Most of the documents in these portals are exactly as dull as they sound. Routine applications for minor developments, administrative decisions about boundary adjustments, procedural updates to existing planning frameworks. The kind of material that exists because planning systems require documentation, and documentation requires somewhere to live. You can browse for hours and find nothing that matters, which is exactly why most people browse for 10 minutes and stop. I didn't stop, not because I have unusual patience, because I had a specific question and I had decided to look until I found an answer or confirmed there wasn't one. The question was simple. Was there anything in the planning documentation for this area that suggested the conventional assessment of the land's value might be based on an incomplete picture? That question required me to read not just the documents directly related to the parcel, but the broader planning discussion for the area it sat in, the zoning history, the infrastructure planning for the surrounding region, the discussions and proposals that reference the area even tangentially. All of it. I set aside 2 hours each evening for the first week. Read through everything I could find that was directly relevant. Found nothing significant in the first 4 days. Found a small procedural reference on the 5th day that I couldn't quite contextualize. A document that mentioned the area in connection with a regional infrastructure discussion. Brief, almost incidental. The kind of reference that appears when something is being mentioned as background context rather than as the main subject. I noted it, kept it, moved on to find what it connected to. That required expanding the search, not just the local planning portal, the regional planning authority, the infrastructure planning body that operated at a level above the municipal one. These documents were denser, more technical, more difficult to navigate without understanding the specific language these bodies use to describe things. I spent the second week learning that language well enough to read the documents properly, not as an expert, as someone who was determined to understand what they were looking at. My partner noticed the evenings of reading, asked what I was working on. I said I was doing research on a property. She asked which one. I said the land parcel I had mentioned. She had the same reaction as my brother. Gentle, well-intentioned. The concern of someone who doesn't want to watch you invest time in something that everyone else has concluded isn't worth the time. I told her I just wanted to be thorough. That thoroughness had never produced a worse outcome than its absence. She accepted that, left me to the reading. The third week was different from the first two, because in the third week I found what I had been looking for. Not dramatically, not in a single moment of revelation. through the gradual accumulation of connected references across multiple documents, a thread that I had been following without being certain it led anywhere. Until it did. The thread started with a regional infrastructure planning document from 14 months earlier. Not a public announcement, not a press release, a working document. The kind produced during the early stages of a planning process when options are being assessed and directions are being considered, but nothing has been formally decided or publicly disclosed. These documents exist in a particular administrative space. They are technically public record, available through the planning portal to anyone who submits the right request or navigates to the right section of a database. But they are not publicized, not indexed in any way that makes them easy to find, not summarized in plain language. They exist as the bureaucratic residue of a planning process that moves slowly and quietly through multiple stages before it ever becomes visible as a public announcement. Most people never encounter them, because most people are looking for information that has already been packaged for public consumption. They are looking in the places where things are easy to find, not in the places where things actually start. The document I found discussed a regional infrastructure corridor, a proposal for significant new infrastructure connecting two areas of the city. The route under consideration passed through several parcels of land, most of them already developed, some of them not. The language was provisional, full of the qualifications that characterize documents produced at the early stage of a planning process. Proposed corridor, subject to further assessment. Multiple route options under consideration. None of it definitive, but the specific area where the land sat was referenced repeatedly across the corridor discussion, not as a peripheral consideration, as a natural junction point in the proposed route, a location where the infrastructure would need to either pass through or connect to something nearby. A location that several of the route options had in common regardless of which specific alignment was ultimately chosen. I read that section 3 times, not because it was difficult to understand, because I wanted to make sure I was reading it accurately rather than reading what I wanted it to say. The distinction matters when you have already formed a hypothesis. The risk of confirmation bias in research is real. You can find patterns in documents that reflect your own expectations rather than the actual content if you're not careful. I was careful. I read it once as a critic, looking for reasons why my interpretation might be wrong, looking for language that qualified or contradicted the reading I had formed, looking for the possibility that I was seeing significance where there was only coincidence. The critical reading held up. The references were not coincidental. The area appeared in this document for a reason, and the reason was directly connected to what the infrastructure corridor was being planned to achieve. I kept reading, found 2 additional documents that cross-referenced the same corridor discussion, one from 11 months earlier, one from 8 months earlier, both at different stages of the planning process, both moving in the same direction, neither of them a public announcement. Both of them evidence of a process that was advancing rather than stalling. The second of the 2 later documents was the most significant. It referenced a formal feasibility assessment that had been commissioned, not a preliminary discussion anymore. A commission study, which in planning terms is a specific and meaningful step. It means someone has decided the proposal is real enough to invest formal resources in evaluating. That a commission feasibility assessment exists is not proof that the infrastructure will be built. Projects get assessed and abandoned all the time, but it is evidence of something more substantial than a preliminary discussion. Evidence of institutional commitment at a level that preliminary documents don't represent. I sat back from the laptop after reading that document, looked at what I had assembled across 3 weeks of reading. The thread of references, the progression from early discussion to formal assessment, the specific and repeated appearance of the area in question across multiple documents from multiple points in time. And I asked myself the honest question, was this significant enough to act on? Now, was it certain? Nothing at this stage was certain. But was it significant enough to justify a purchase at the current asking price? The asking price was low, had been declining for years. The risk was bounded. The potential upside, if the infrastructure proceeded, was substantial. The research supported the view that the infrastructure was more than a preliminary idea. The answer was yes, but I was not going to act on one source. Not on documents I had found myself without any professional validation. I needed one more check, something independent, something that would either confirm what I had found or give me a reason to stop. The second source required more thought to identify than the research itself had, because what I needed was specific. Someone with professional knowledge of the planning process in this area. Someone who would have visibility into infrastructure discussions at the regional level. Someone I could approach in a way that allowed me to verify what I had found without revealing exactly what I had found or why I was asking. That last requirement mattered, not for dishonest reasons, but because the moment you tell someone you are considering buying a specific piece of land, the conversation changes. People start managing their responses, thinking about their own position, considering whether they want to be associated with advice that leads to a decision that might not work out. I didn't want a managed response. I wanted an honest one. So I thought carefully about how to approach the conversation. I had a contact from several years earlier, someone I had worked alongside briefly in a professional context, who had since moved into a role in regional planning administration. Not a senior position, mid-level, but the kind of role that gives you visibility into what is being discussed at the stages before public disclosure. We had stayed loosely in touch. The occasional message. The kind of professional relationship that remains warm without being close. I reached out, suggested a coffee, said I was doing some research into the area and would value a conversation. He agreed without hesitation. We met on a Wednesday lunchtime. I want to be clear about what I did and didn't do in that conversation. I did not ask him to share anything confidential. I did not ask for inside information. I did not put him in a position where responding honestly would have required him to breach any professional obligation. What I did was ask about the general planning direction for the area, about whether there was significant infrastructure discussion happening at the regional level, about how active the planning pipeline was for that part of the city. Questions that allowed him to confirm or deny the general direction without requiring him to speak to specifics he wasn't authorized to disclose. His responses were careful, appropriately so. He didn't confirm specific projects, didn't name specific routes or timelines. But the way he spoke about the area had a quality I recognized. The particular carefulness of someone who is being accurate without being complete. He said the area had become more interesting to the planning bodies than it had been historically, that there were discussions happening that suggested the infrastructure picture might look different in the medium term than it had in the recent past. He said it with the measured language of someone who knows more than they are saying and is saying only what they can say. That was enough. Not confirmation, not a source I could cite to anyone, but enough to tell me that what I had found in the documents was not a misreading, that the thread I had followed across 3 weeks of planning portals had led somewhere real. I thanked him for the coffee, said nothing about the land, said nothing about what I intended to do with the conversation, drove home, sat at the kitchen table, and made my decision. I called my solicitor the following morning, instructed her to begin the purchase process. We moved quietly. No announcement to family or friends. No conversation with my real estate agent about what I had found or why I was proceeding. Just the straightforward legal process of acquiring a parcel of land at a price that reflected 4 years of nobody wanting it. The seller completed without question. When you have been trying to sell something for 4 years and a buyer appears without negotiating aggressively on an already reduced price, you complete. The transaction closed on a gray Thursday morning. I received the confirmation, transferred the funds, and became the owner of a piece of land that everyone around me had concluded was worthless. I told my partner that evening. She asked if I was certain. I told her I had done the research as carefully as I knew how to do it, that nothing was certain. but that I was confident in what I had found and comfortable with the decision. She said she trusted my judgment. Then she asked how long we might be waiting. I said I didn't know exactly. Planning timelines are not precise. The documents I had read suggested movement, but didn't specify when the public stage of the process would arrive. Could be months. Could be longer. She nodded, said she could live with that. I went to bed that night carrying the particular quiet of someone who has done the work, who has checked it properly, who has made the decision with the information available, and who now simply has to wait for the world to catch up with what the documents already said. The waiting period lasted 4 months. I want to describe those 4 months accurately, because they were not dramatic. They were not filled with anxiety or second-guessing or the particular restlessness of someone wondering if they have made a mistake. They were just ordinary months, life continuing at its normal pace. Work, routine, the usual texture of days that don't carry any particular significance while they are happening. The land sat there, unchanged, looking exactly as it had always looked, irregular and unremarkable, and located in an area that the world had not yet found a reason to pay attention to. I checked in on the planning portals occasionally, not obsessively, once every few weeks, looking for any movement in the documentation that might indicate the process was progressing toward the public stage. There were small signs, additional documents appearing in the relevant sections, references to assessment stages being completed, the administrative language of a process moving through its required steps. Nothing public, nothing that would have meant anything to someone who hadn't been following the thread for months, but enough to tell me the process was still alive and still advancing. My brother asked about the land once during those months, casually, in the way you ask about something you consider a concluded mistake rather than an ongoing situation, whether I had thought any more about selling it, cutting my losses before they deepened. I told him I was comfortable holding it. He let it go. The real estate agent sent a general market update email in the second month, the kind of routine communication that goes to an entire client list. I read it, found nothing in it related to the area where the land sat, filed it. Nothing in those 4 months suggested to anyone around me that anything was coming. That was the point. The process I had been following in those planning documents was designed to move quietly through its stages before it became public. The people managing it were not withholding information maliciously. They were simply following the standard progression of a planning process that requires internal completion before external disclosure. That progression takes the time it takes. And during the time it takes, the information exists in documents that are technically available but practically invisible, available to anyone willing to find them, invisible to everyone who wasn't looking. I had been looking. Everyone else had been waiting for the announcement. The announcement came on a Tuesday morning. The city published it through the standard public communication channels. A press release, a formal planning notice, a summary document written in plain language designed for public consumption. Everything that had been moving quietly through administrative channels for over a year arrived in the public domain simultaneously. The infrastructure corridor was confirmed. The route was specified. The rezoning of the surrounding area was outlined. The development implications for the affected parcels were described. I read the announcement at my kitchen table. Read it the way you read something you have been expecting rather than something that surprises you, with the calm recognition of a thing arriving rather than the shock of a thing appearing. I put the phone face down, made a coffee, came back to the table, picked the phone up. 3 missed calls. My real estate agent, my brother, a friend who had said 4 months earlier that I was making a mistake. The agent called again while I was looking at the screen. I watched it ring, let go to voicemail, not out of drama, just because there was nothing urgent to discuss yet. The announcement was public. The land's position in relation to the infrastructure was now visible to anyone reading it. The value implications were obvious to anyone with basic knowledge of how infrastructure affects land prices. The calls were going to keep coming. From the agent, from family, from people I knew in the industry, and eventually from people I didn't know. Developers, acquisition teams, People whose job is to move quickly when an announcement like this creates an opportunity. I knew all of that was coming. I was not in a hurry to respond to any of it, because the research had been done months ago. The purchase had been completed months ago. The waiting was over. And now the only thing required was patience of a different kind. Not the patience of waiting for something to happen. The patience of someone who holds something valuable and understands that the first offer is rarely the right one. That the moment of maximum urgency for the people calling you is rarely the moment of maximum value for you. That waiting a little longer, listening a little more carefully, understanding the full range of what is now possible, is worth more than the relief of moving quickly because other people want you to. I finished my coffee, opened a notebook, and started writing down everything I needed to understand before I responded to anyone. The calls kept coming through that Tuesday afternoon. I let most of them go to voicemail. Not all. My partner I called back immediately. She had seen the announcement and put the connection together herself. Her reaction was quiet and genuine, not the sudden enthusiasm of someone converted by an outcome, just the particular warmth of someone who had trusted a process they didn't fully understand and was now watching it arrive somewhere real. She asked what happened next. I told her I didn't know exactly yet, that the next step was understanding the full picture before responding to anyone who wanted to move quickly. She said that sounded right. I called my brother that evening, not because I needed to, because he deserved a direct conversation rather than a voicemail. He answered on the second ring. The tone was different from the conversation about cutting losses. He said he had seen the announcement, said he was looking at the map of the corridor route, said he understood now why I had bought what I had bought. He asked how I had known. I told him I had read the planning documents. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked which planning documents. I explained the general process, the planning portals, the infrastructure working documents, the thread of references I had followed across 3 weeks of reading. He was quiet again, longer this time. Then he said something I have thought about since. He said he had never considered that those documents were publicly available, that he had assumed anything meaningful would be disclosed through the usual channels when the time came, that it had never occurred to him that the usual channels were simply the last stage of a process that had been running in documents anyone could access for over a year. I told him that was true of most people, that the assumption that meaningful information arrives through obvious channels is understandable, and almost always costs something, because the gap between when information exists and when it becomes obvious is exactly where the value lives. He said he was going to start paying attention to planning documents. I told him it was worth the time. The real estate agent called again on Wednesday morning. I picked up. He was professional about it. Said he had seen the announcement. Said the land was obviously now in a completely different position than his earlier assessment had suggested. Said he would be happy to assist with the sale when I was ready. I thanked him. Said I would be in touch when I had a clearer picture of what I wanted to do. He said, of course. Before he ended the call, he asked how I had known. I told him I had done some research into the planning documents for the area. He said he hadn't been aware there was anything significant in those documents. I said it had taken some time to find. That was all I offered. He seemed to understand that more detail wasn't coming. The developer approaches started arriving by the end of the first week. 3 of them within 7 days of the announcement. Different organizations, different proposals, all of them interested in acquiring the land. All of them moving with the particular urgency of people who had identified an opportunity and wanted to close it before someone else did. I received each approach professionally, asked the right questions, gathered the information each developer offered, made no commitments, expressed no urgency, and said I would be in touch when I had considered all available options. That patience had a visible effect on the conversations. People who approach with urgency and find the other party unhurried tend to recalibrate. The ones who are genuinely interested don't disappear. They come back with better terms. The ones who were counting on the seller's eagerness to close quickly tend to lose interest, which is useful information about which parties are worth continuing to talk to. I spent 3 weeks doing for the sale what I had done before the purchase. Research, understanding the full implications of the infrastructure announcement for the land's development potential. The rezoning details, what the land could now support in terms of development density and use. What comparable parcels in similar positions had transacted for following similar infrastructure announcements elsewhere. Building a picture of what the land was actually worth now, rather than accepting someone else's assessment of it. Ms. Farrell assisted with the legal framework for the eventual transaction. The same careful approach I had applied to the research I applied to the negotiation. Unhurried, specific, based on what the evidence said, rather than what the most prominent offer happened to be. The right buyer emerged from the process clearly. Not the first to approach. Not the one with the most recognizable name. The one whose proposal most accurately reflected the land's genuine potential. Whose terms were structured in a way that protected my position through the transaction rather than creating exposure after it. Whose legal team engaged with Ms. Farrell in the straightforward manner of people conducting a legitimate transaction rather than people looking for leverage. We negotiated, honestly, over several weeks, each session moving the terms closer to something that reflected the full value of what was being transferred. I did not rush the process. There was no pressure compelling me to close before I was ready, which meant I didn't close before I was ready. The transaction completed on a Monday morning. I received the confirmation, looked at the number, sat with it for a moment, then called my partner. She asked how it had gone. I told her the number. She was quiet for a while. Then she said the 3 weeks of evening reading had turned out to be worth it. I told her that was the whole of it, that there was no other explanation, no special insight, no privileged access, no talent beyond the willingness to read documents that were available to anyone who bothered to look. The land had not been worthless. It had been misread by an agent who relied on what was already known, by investors who relied on what others had already concluded, by family members who reasonably trusted the consensus rather than investigating it. None of them were wrong to do what they did. Most of the time, the consensus is right. Most of the time, the thing everyone has passed on has been passed on for good reasons. But not always. And the gap between most of the time and always is where the work lives. The work of reading what others haven't read, of following threads that others haven't followed, of spending 3 weeks in planning portals when everyone else is relying on the announcement that hasn't happened yet. I think about the real estate agent's voicemail from that Tuesday afternoon sometimes. The one I let ring out. The one from the man who had told me bluntly that the land was a dead investment not worth pursuing. I listened to it eventually. He said he had seen the announcement and wanted to talk. He sounded like someone who understood something new about the situation, about what had been in those documents, about what careful reading of publicly available information looks like when it's applied properly. I called him back the following week, not to make a point, just because he was a professional I had always respected, and because the conversation was worth having. He said he was going to start reading planning documents more carefully. I told him it was worth the time. He said he was beginning to understand that. The money changed things in the practical ways that a life-changing amount of money changes things. But what I think about most when I look back at the whole experience is not the outcome. It is the process. The evenings at the kitchen table. The dense bureaucratic language gradually becoming legible. The thread assembling slowly across documents that nobody else had connected. The specific moment of understanding that what I was looking at was real. That the consensus was wrong. Not because the people who formed it were careless. Because they were looking in the places where things are easy to find. And the thing worth finding was somewhere else entirely. The most valuable information is almost never the loudest. It is the information sitting quietly in the documents that everyone had access to and nobody bothered to read. If this story resonated with you, the patience of it, the simple power of doing the research that everyone else decided wasn't worth their time, leave it in the comments. I read every one, and the next story is already waiting for you.